welcome to the second session at the conference. Now we have prominent guests all the way from Netherlands or the US, depending on how you... Yeah. Yeah. So her name is Adriel Wallick.
Yes.
Close? Okay.
You got it. You're fine.
Okay. Good. And her talk has at least a really interesting title, Making Games by Heart.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, it's kind of a talk about feelings a little bit.
Oh. So
and constraints and stuff, and like real technical things, but also feelings.
Some really emotional talk. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, I think I get rambly, but it's okay. Rambling's good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hi. Like you said, my name's Adriel Wallick, and I'm an independent game developer. I'm originally from the United States, but now I am based out of the Netherlands. So I guess the best place to start is a brief history of me, who I am, and what I do, if you don't know me. So I actually started my professional career outside of video games. I was a programmer of database and command routing software on a next-generation weather satellite, and then I went on to program some ground processing algorithms for that same satellite, which has nothing to do with video games. So after a number of years of doing this, I sort of came to terms with the fact that I hated what I was doing and I was unhappy and I just really wanted to make games. So I started making games on the side. You know, I made them after work and on the weekends and basically every spare waking moment or every moment I should have been sleeping. Instead, you know, making games. And I started going to developer meetups where I was living at the time, which was in Boston, which is like the northeastern of the United States. We just had a zillion developer meetups that I could go to, you know, once a week probably. And eventually I found people to work on little side games with me, and there was a small indie studio called Firehose Games that was hiring, and I was able to quit my current job and start making games with them. So at Firehose Games, I was part of a team that was contracted out to Harmonix at the time, so I was working on a Rock Band game. And I never actually worked with Firehose, which was interesting because I was at this indie company, but I was working on a AAA game and I never actually worked with the indie company. So I worked on Rock Band. After that, I moved on to another company that did sort of non-original IP commission work, and eventually I left that to pursue the thing that I really wanted to do, you know, which was make my own games. So yeah, that was about a year and a half ago where I was able to quit my full-time job and focus on my own creations. And in that time, I lived a mostly nomadic lifestyle. I created an annual game jam that takes place on a train in the United States. You know, I worked on a number of unannounced indie projects, and I spent an entire year making a new game every single week. So 52 weeks making 52 games. And for most of this talk, I'm going to talk about that. So yeah, when I first quit my job and I started making my own games, I was really excited to explore this newfound freedom that I had. You know, I was finally free to pursue all the ideas that I had in my head and create all these things that I wanted to create and make the exact games I wanted to make. So here I was, you know, I had enough money saved up to float myself for a while, and I had basically what felt like all the ideas that anybody could ever hold in one head, and all the time in the world. But it turns out that freedom is really, really hard to deal with. I forget who said it, but somebody once told me as I was struggling through this that it's really hard to think outside the box when there's no box. So once you remove the box, whatever. And you know, I really couldn't agree with that notion more, because I spent the first few months of this newfound freedom just sort of working day in and day out, and working and making things. And you know, after the first few months, all I really had to show for myself was a few empty Unity projects and a rapidly growing feeling of failure and inadequacy, which is not the greatest way to start your flourishing indie developer career. So after watching me struggle through this for a few months of just not being able to do anything, fellow developer Rami Ismail of Lambier suggested to me, you know, why don't you just sort of add a deadline? Take the idea that you're working on, add a deadline for a week, and then do that for a week and then stop and move on to something else. So I did that, and it was a simple suggestion, and it slowly morphed into this giant thing that I spent the entire next year of my life doing. So yeah, so what Game a Week did for me was that it took all of that freedom that I had and then sort of took it away. And there were a number of rules that slowly became part of Game a Week, and every single one of them was designed to address a particular freedom that was harmful and counterproductive to everything I wanted to do. which was really helpful. So now I'm going to kind of go through the 4 major caveats of Game of Week and sort of why those and how they're helpful. So the biggest, sort of most important one is the weekly deadline, and it's sort of the namesake of it, so by far the most important. Because before I started working on making a game every week, I had this incredibly nebulous goal of I want to make a game, which is basically the most unhelpful goal you can possibly have because it means nothing. Like, there's no timeline, there's no substance to it, it's just, there's nothing to even motivate you. If you sit down with a goal of make a game, what does that mean? Is it done in 2 weeks? Is it done in 5 months? Is it done in 5 years? Is it, what is it? How long should you be working on it? How fast should you be working on it? It's just nothing, And then what is a game? Is it a game when you've sold it? Is it a game when it's available? Is it a game when you just sort of stop working on it? Is it a game when somebody played with it? Is it a game when it gets a 10 out of 10 on IGN? What is a game? So by putting this weekly deadline on myself, I now had an answer to at least one of those questions. I would be working on this game for a week. I have a week. That's all I've got. Nothing else. And then the next one that was really helpful in a multitude of ways was releasing every single game to the public. Because this sort of answers the other part of that what is a game question. I chose for Game a Week to sort of define a game as something that I released to the public, and that meant that the term game was used very loosely because a lot of, the things that I released were sometimes not often playable, but whatever, I released it, so it was a game in my eyes. So at the end of every single week, I had to post my game on my website, tweet it out, basically make it available and not try and hide it under the carpet. And this action sort of accomplishes a few things. So the first thing it does is that it gives you this sort of sense of accountability, because one of the major things that I struggled with when first starting out was the fact that I am my own worst boss. Because now that I had nobody real to answer to, I could just always make excuses as to why I couldn't work on something that day. Because there's always a reason to not do something. I have to go grocery shopping. I obviously can't work on a game today. That's way too much work for one person for one day. Or I'm tired. I gotta take a nap, because that'll make me more productive later, I promise. And those make total sense in your own head when you're the only person who is responsible for telling yourself no. You're not going to tell yourself not to take a nap. Naps are awesome. So now I have these outside people, and I had no illusions about these people waiting with bated breath for my games every week, but at the very least, I could just sort of filter all of my excuses through the lens of something that wasn't me. And other people don't care if you want to take a nap or go eat a croissant. They just want to play the game that you made. There's no more excuses. And then another upside to releasing a game every week is that it gives you practice releasing games, because releasing a game is terrifying. It doesn't matter how small or how big it is, whether it's a jam game or a game that you've just spent the last 10 years of your life making. It's always terrifying to take this thing that you've put a little bit of your heart and your soul into and is this reflection of how good you are as a designer or a programmer or an artist, and release it to the wild and let people play with it. It makes you vulnerable. And every week I had to open myself up for judgment from my peers and colleagues and people I looked up to and respected and people I've never even talked to. They all had this ability every single week to play this thing that was a little bit of me. But by doing that every week, the intensity of that feeling fades a bit, and every week you get better at dealing with the various emotions of releasing a game, and every week it becomes a little bit easier. Although I wouldn't say it ever really became easy, just sort of easier, at least. And then, in addition to that, releasing a game every week opens this door to feedback, especially when you're releasing it on the internet, because everybody will have an opinion of anything that you put on the internet. Doesn't matter what it is. For games, it doesn't matter how big or little it is, they'll have an opinion, and somebody will tell you that opinion. And then listen to that opinion, you listen to the feedback, you find out what works, what didn't work, and even if you don't get to apply it to that particular game, you get to take all those lessons with you every single week, to make the usability of the game better, to make the interface better, to figure out what mechanics make sense to you and don't make sense to anybody else. Basically, all the feedback that you have is transferable to all future projects. And then another thing that I did every single week is that I forced myself to write a postmortem and reflect on what I did that week. I used the postmortem mostly to remind myself where my ideas came from and talk about what went right and what went wrong and what I learned from that week. And it became easy to look back week at week and pick out problematic design behaviors and problematic time management behaviors, which I tried to fix every week. I wouldn't say I always fixed my time management behaviors, but I tried really, really hard. And then in addition, looking back, every single week is this nice little confidence boost, because there's some weeks where you sit down and you go, I didn't do anything this week, I didn't learn anything from this game, and then you go to write your postmortem, and you just get amazed at all the stuff that you learned and all the things that you did accomplish without even really realizing it. It's always nice to give yourself a little pat on the back and say, hey, look at this thing I made that I didn't even think I made. And the final sort of big rule for Game a Week was that I had to do a new idea every single week. And this one was hard, because when I went first, full-time indie, I felt like my head was full of all the ideas that I've been thinking about for years, and I had this endless supply of ideas that would last me a lifetime, or at least a year, probably. So this was a rule that I sort of instated on myself, hoping that it would be this really good opportunity to plow through all of my amazing, wonderful ideas in rapid succession and find the one that was going to be making me my indie millions. But it turned out that I really only had a few weeks worth of ideas, and they weren't very good, because they were all the ideas that have just been sort of in my head, and they weren't focused, and they weren't refined, and they were just concepts that I've been obsessing over. And now that I was exploring them, they weren't great, and that sucked. That was a big morale hit. But now that I had those ideas out of my head and had space in there, there's all this empty room for new ideas to come into. And this space sort of gave me an ability to be inspired by everything around me. The smallest thing would spark an idea. There'd be a windmill or a bird or a rock, and the rock would look like a monster, so now I'm making a game about a monster that eats rocks, Or, all these ideas that you didn't even know you were thinking about. There's tons of games that I can trace back to something very specific like that. Like I'm laying in bed and I'm listening to a song, and the song makes me think of space, and then space makes me think of gravity, so then gravity makes me think of orbits, and now all of a sudden I'm making a game about orbiting around a planet and catching stars in space. It's just all these little things that, because there's all this room in there that's left, all these little nuggets of ideas can come in and just blossom. And it's hard to do that when your mind is clouded with other ideas, and Game a Week sort of very quickly and very rapidly gets rid of all of those ideas that are in your head. And it stops you from getting stuck into a loop as well. If you have this one amazing idea, you run this risk of merely rehashing that idea over and over and over again. Which is good, because iteration is good. I don't want to poo-poo all over iteration, but when your idea and your design is unfocused and your idea isn't really clear, then you're just sort of iterating on nothing. And by forcing a new idea every week, then you're sort of iterating on your idea creation process. So those are sort of the 4 rules that I adhered to and sort of put constraints on myself for during Game a Week. And then while writing this talk, I realized that there was sort of a 5th rule that I never really realized that I was taking part of. Because during Game a Week, I constrained myself to one tool. There were some weeks where I branched out and worked on something else, but for the most part, it was Unity. I did this because everybody knew how to use Unity. I was quick with it, but looking back, I realized it was sort of, I could place this under a 5th rule of Game a Week. Pick one tool and run with it. Because we have this thing that's happening where we have these multitudes of tools, it's a tongue twister, that are becoming available all the time. It's easier than ever for somebody to sit down and make a game. You want to make a text adventure, here's Twine. You want to make a fancy first-person shooter, here's Unreal. You want to make a 2D game, here's Game Maker. If you're 6 years old and you want to learn how to make a game, there's Scratch. Literally every type of game you'd ever want to make has a tool that's available somewhere and will help you make it. In addition to that, you have all this limitless information at your fingertips via the internet about how to use these tools, as well as suggestions for additional tools to use instead of that. And I'm not saying that learning new tools and technology is bad. In fact, the weeks that I branched out from Unity were probably some of the most technologically educational weeks of the entire Game a Week project. But when your goal is to create a game, it's becoming really easy to be distracted by all the ways that you can make a game. That's not good. So yeah. Every single one of these rules of Game a Week was specifically designed to take a piece of freedom away from me, which sounds very counterintuitive, because everybody who is independent or makes games or is creative just sort of strives for this freedom to do whatever you want. But like I said, total and complete freedom is absolutely terrifying. I started referring to my inability to make anything as this freedom paralysis, because that's exactly what it was. Everything is this big, insurmountable task when you have the whole world at your fingertips, and it's easy to become paralyzed by all the choices that you can make. You see this mountain in the distance, and you think, yeah, I could probably climb that mountain. Then you start climbing that mountain, and you realize it's a way bigger mountain than you thought it was. So you see another mountain sort of off to the side, and you think, okay, maybe I could climb that mountain. You know, it looks a little easier, it looks a little smaller. So you abandon your current mountain, you move over to a new mountain, and you realize that it's also a way bigger mountain than you thought, and then you repeat this forever until you never climb any mountains. And the only way you're ever going to climb that mountain or make that game is by putting constraints back onto yourself and helping yourself break these insurmountable tasks down to little easily attainable goals. But also, there's a flip side to this. As with everything, there is always too much of a good thing. So I talked way back at the beginning about how I started my career outside of game development. Despite always being a big fan of games and being interested in where they came from and dabbling around in like super rudimentary game design as a child, I convinced myself that there was no way I could make games for a living, ever. Because I'd put this constraint on myself and told myself that real adults had real jobs and real jobs were not making video games. And I'd spent years living under this mountain of excuses as to why I just couldn't make games, you know? And eventually I realized that most of them were just silly limitations that I was putting onto myself, but it's the same excuses that you hear from everybody all the time. You know, I can't make a game because, you know, I don't have the time, or I can't make a game because I don't have the technical skills, or, you know, I don't know where to start, and I don't know how to draw, and it's just, you know, I can't because whatever. And it took me a while to realize what the difference between these excuses and the limitations that I was placing on myself via Game of Week, because they're both constraints, they're both limitations, both things are telling me I can't do something for whatever reason. But, you know, what it came down to was the awareness of the limitation. You know, one is an excuse to not do things, and one is sort of guiding you to do those things better. Because if you think about, you know, why you're not working on exactly what you want to be working on, like really think about that. And is the reason you're not doing it because, you know, something you just assumed to be true? Because I spent years not making games because I assumed it wasn't a real career. Like, literal years just not doing this. And it's all because of the assumptions that it wasn't, you know, what real adults did, or you needed to have all sorts of crazy, you know, artificial intelligence and computer graphics skills and technical skills that I just didn't have, and approximately a million other excuses, you know, that took me years to figure out that, you know, they weren't true. I sort of have this sneaky goal in life to point out all the limitations that we put onto ourselves on a daily basis that sort of stop us from achieving our full potential. Because it's amazing when you start digging down at people's excuses as to why they're not doing something. You keep digging, you keep making them explain it. 9 times out of 10, you get to a point where they just can't explain away their excuse anymore, and the truth comes out of, nah, you know, I'm just sort of scared and I rely on this excuse as a convenient way to not do that. And get myself out of a scary situation where I'm vulnerable. So yeah, we're at this really interesting point in game development where we have more resources available to us than any other generation of game developers that came before us, and it's getting easier than ever to make a game. And it's only ever going to get easier to make games. And I wouldn't say it's getting easier to make good games, but it's getting easier to make games. And we're at this fantastic point where we can literally make anything we want. From Commodore 64 games to games that take advantage of virtual reality headsets and haptic feedback gloves. And the overwhelming amount of things that we can make, you know, can so easily cause us to fall into this loop of creating the same thing over and over again. You know, we easily get stuck on the same idea that worked last time, because we'll just make it better, we've got better tools this time. Or we can look at all the tools that are available and just give up, because there's too many and I don't know where to start. And we can very easily be disillusioned into thinking that now that it's so easy to make games, obviously all the good games have been made and there's no point in making any games anymore. There's about a million reasons to tell yourself to not make a game. Despite it technically getting easier for us to make games, it's getting harder emotionally. Because in addition to all of the overwhelming resources and freedoms at our fingertips causing us to freak out and shut down all the time that I just talked about, there's also this fact that we're all connected to each other's lives so much more than we've ever been before. You know, between Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr and whatever countless other ways for us to pry into each other's lives, we're constantly on display to one another, and what if you make a game that's terrible? What if you make a game and you don't actually end up making a game and you fail? What then? That's terrible. Because we create this myth in our heads in game development that someone can just sort of sit down and with infinite resources and time, they can make the next Antichamber or Minecraft or Stanley Parable or whatever. But it's not true. Like, none of those people sat down and just made that. They worked and they failed and they worked and they failed until they were able to make those games. They worked for years, they tried new things, they failed at a million different things, and they tried again and again. Had constraints, had time constraints, had financial constraints, had flawed visions. And all of those things had to be true before they could make those games. Which, speaking of, Alex Bruce, who made Antichamber, gave a really, really good talk about this sort of topic at GDC. Not this last one, but the one before, that you should all watch forever. It's called An Overnight Success, 9 Years in the Making, I believe. It's very good. Everybody should go or check it out. Anyway, so what if I fail? Failure's okay, because everybody fails. I fail a lot. I start projects that I give up on all the time. During Game a Week, there were a bunch of weeks where I just sort of made nothing, which felt terrible. And then even when I did make a game, I would fail at making the game I wanted to make, or I would fail at learning the thing I wanted to learn, or whatever. However, every time you fail, you learn. And so, I'd learned something about the game-making process, and I'd learned something about what I can and can't do, and I'd learned my limits, and I learned how to better myself as a creative person. And that's okay, because failure is sort of a meaningful part of any endeavor in life that is worthwhile. If you're not failing, you're probably not taking enough chances. And, sure, you should prepare for what happens if you fail, but you shouldn't fear it. You can learn from success, but learning from failure is about a million times more productive. The potential to fail is very frightening, but we shouldn't really let it stop us from doing things. We're basically all here probably constantly thinking about all the things that we'd like to do. But there's a huge difference between thinking about them and actually doing them. And I find that the difference is usually when we stop thinking about the assumptions and limitations that we're putting on ourselves and think instead about the constraints that you can use to make yourself better. So that's sort of where I want to end it, my big ramble about failure, and constraints. So there you go. Any questions about how awesome failing is? Yes?
What did you do after?
So I finished doing Game a Week, what was it, like December of, what year is it now, 2015? So it's December of 2014. So it was like 5 months ago, 4 months ago. It's April now, 4 months ago. And I took the rest of the year not doing anything because making a game every single week is really exhausting, I found out. You wouldn't think it is, but it is. And so there was this point, you can even see it in the games that I made for the very final weeks where I'm tired. My brain is just broken and it doesn't know how to make games anymore, and everything is just this terrible slog of time moving forward. So I took a good few weeks where I just didn't do anything, and then I took on a few contract jobs and did things that I wasn't in charge of, you know what I mean? Like I needed to work on things that I didn't have to think about and I could just do. I did that for a while, and now I'm actually working on a game that is unannounced at the moment that I'm excited about. And then there was just Train Jam a month ago. Train Jam was this year again, because I do Train Jam every year right before GDC, and that's the big game jam that's on a train that I alluded to at the beginning. So that usually takes up a big chunk of the first part of my year because it's always around March because it's always right before GDC. So I've just sort of been doing odds and ends things since then. But the big part was taking a break right after because my poor brain was so tired. Yes?
Yeah, I gotta say, you hit on the points where I failed exactly, the freedom paralysis.
It's so bad.
It is.
People are all yeah, freedom's great. No, it's not.
I wasn't even aware what was happening to me.
Yeah, because you go down this you go down this path, and it's this spiral of oh my gosh, why am I wasting this time? I must suck. And then like you hate yourself, and then you can't make a game because you hate yourself, and then because you're not making a game, you're hating yourself because you're squandering, and it's this spiral downward of depression and sadness, and it took somebody else completely saying like, hey, maybe you should like do something to kick me out of it and actually do something. So yeah, that's why I like to talk about it, because people don't realize how just like disheartening that is to have all this freedom and go down this spiral of nothingness and terrible.
Yeah, you came and talk about it.
Yay!
That's often people's experience with PhD.
Hmm?
So doing a PhD,
Yeah.
that's often the experience of starting a PhD, because they have freedom and then they start spiraling and they're supposed to be getting resources.
See, this is why I stopped at my bachelor's degree.
When you were talking, I saw some of what you were doing was basically what we as PhD supervisors have to provide our PhD students.
Right.
That's why you have supervision for these.
Yeah, because you need somebody else to tell you what to do. It doesn't matter how driven you are. Like, I'm a very driven and motivated person, and yet still, every single day, I had to take that extra nap and eat another croissant and not work on a game. Like, you need somebody else to hold yourself accountable.
So my question related to that is, do you see a role for, like, you had a person give you a tip, and then you personally implemented that. The process of mentoring other people, could you see there a potential role of being, a monthly kind of a mentor for people who are in the freedom space, where you say, right, once a month, show me what you do.
Yeah, there's actually sort of a movement I see sort of via Twitter and stuff like that for people to take part in these things. Like, there is a movement of 1 game a month that's started by the guy who runs, I think the same guy who runs Ludum Dare, but I could be wrong. But it's basically a big web page where people sign up and you get points for, submitting a game every month, and there's streak bonuses. And then there's another website, which the name is escaping me right now, but it's something about doing things for consistent amounts of time and sort of being able to put yourself in a pool of like, hey, hold me accountable for making a game once every 3 weeks, or hold me accountable for going for a run every other day. Like, it's that kind of website where you can you get motivation from other people. And I think there is a really good, thing to be said for people just being there to be the person who can be like, okay, you didn't make your game this week, what's up with that? Because, even though I said, Rami sort of gave me the idea and I ran with it, he was also there for the first, 5 or 6 weeks just on me about, hey, it's Saturday and your game is due tomorrow, have you done anything yet? And I, get all sheepish and I'm just like, oh, well, maybe I'll just take an extra day. And he's just like, no, you said you were going to have it done tomorrow. And you really need that for the first few weeks, because the first few weeks of any habit are difficult, because I think somebody says it takes 11 weeks to form a habit or something, and it was about the 11-week period where I was just like, all right, now this is just what I do. Or is it 14 weeks?
40 days.
Oh, 40 days? What is that? Is that 11 weeks? Whatever. It was. I remember doing the math and being amazed that it was literally the same point in game a week where I was just like, okay, I don't need somebody hounding on me all the time. I can just do it. Yeah.
So, a game a week.
Yes. Right.
The game you're working on now sounds like a video game.
Yeah.
What are the most important lessons you learned from gaming that you might want to
I would say the most important lessons I learned were all in relation to scope. I got really, really, really good at de-scoping and seeing what I could very quickly prototype in terms of a mechanic and what I very quickly couldn't prototype in terms of a mechanic. And if it was something I couldn't quickly prototype as a mechanic, how to hone that down to turn it into a mechanic that is quick to prototype. Because if you can prototype one mechanic in 1 week, that mechanic of that game will take you 3 or 4 months to actually polish into a workable thing. And I think that's a really good guideline to sort of stick with. So my big thing was learning how to take an idea and turn it into an actual usable idea, which is usually about 2% of your probably original idea. So I got really good at that. I got really, really, really fast at Unity, which helps with everything because that's usually what I do all of my work in. But I think the scoping was the big thing, because basically every single week I'd have this idea, and then I'd spend the first day cutting it in half and cutting it in half, and maybe cutting it in half again, and then like throwing away parts of it and then cutting it in half again, and just getting really, really good at finding the little nugget that's the core of the idea that you had in the first place, which I think was the most valuable lesson. And then the secondary most valuable lesson is the whole like last part that I talked about was failure, because the first time I didn't make a game for Game a Week, I just felt awful about myself, because I'm just like, oh no, this is the thing I was doing and I didn't do it, and I'm the worst developer in the world, and if I can't even make a game in a week, how am I ever going to make a game that's good ever? And I'm awful. But you very quickly get over that, but it's like it was the constant being able to fail in sort of a safe way, and realizing that people aren't going to hate me forever if I fail at one little thing, ever. So that was a good secondary lesson in the non-technical sense. Yeah?
So you obviously are a very driven and passionate person. So you want to make all these games because you want to make games, right? But what you're saying also, you learn a lot. Very much.
Right.
So I was thinking, okay, you learn a lot, and like I would be a guy like me who teach game design to students who are like not so driven, maybe like you, or a little bit younger, not that experienced. You think that's something you can do on like say a 21-year-old who doesn't know anything about anything yet? Is that too soon? When can you how do you think that's like a teaching method? Is that something you would recommend, like when they go down a little after their bachelor, or start early, or is it just like?
I think, and this may just be being kind of a hard ass, but I feel like it's good to weed out the people who don't have the passion to make the games anyway. Not that you have to be the most passionate person in the world to make a game. Like you can be just this tiny little cog in a giant AAA studio, and that's fine. But like, I feel like it's probably a good exercise to have them, faced with a real world situation of like, no, you have to make this game in this really tight time constraint, and if you don't do it, you get a failing grade for this project, and see what happens. And I don't know, I feel like you gain a lot of experience from being faced with real world situations, and so making it safe in a classroom feels really odd, because I feel like it would be a lot more educational for them to just have to do something. And I feel like that would be sort of the most prominent thing that you could take away from something like this in terms of teaching students sort of how to make games or what the process is like, because that's one of the things, I like college and I went to university and everything is great, but it's one of the things that I really disliked about my university education is there was no point where I was ever faced with a real situation, and so everything after I graduated was just so much different than everything I learned in school. And not that I don't use the education that I got from my school, because I do use it every now and again, but everything else I learned about the industry and about how games are made and all the additional things that go into games and software development and technology that's outside of just the little classroom things was just, I was unprepared for that, and I think we need to do a better job of preparing our next generation for that.
Because that's real life.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can't handle it, then okay, sorry, you fail.
Yeah, because usually students are very like, they have in one semester, like in 5 months, like 2 games. Oh, that's too much. They want to have this protected cocoon that is school, that is university. So I was just wondering if you, so they say go ahead, just do a couple of weeks with a game a month and a week, and see if there's a while.
Yeah, that's easy for me to say now that I'm not in school anymore, but yeah, definitely.
It's okay with that.
You guys can fight, duel.
You said that you made a small keyboard every week.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that there's a lot of voting to this stuff or something.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it for more than just yourself.
What was the question again?
What is small keyboards? You have 52 keyboards from every week.
Your postmortems.
Oh, my postmortems, yeah, I have a lot.
Have you thought about making some, using them for some public or?
So I posted them all on my blog, which you can go and read. Or I also I wrote a really, really long post-game a week postmortem. So it's like a postmortem of all my postmortems that I posted up on Gamma Sutra, which you can find on there. So I have talked about it, in sort of the public sense and the written sense where you can sort of go and read things. But I haven't done anything beyond that other than yapping about it whenever I can.
It can be processed also and made something more.
Maybe. I never really thought about it. Because after Game of Week was over, I was just like, I'm done. I'm done with this. I'm not thinking about it again anymore for a little while.
So, so my question is, your experience of freedom paralysis, right, is a personal experience, and certainly it's clear to identify that a lot of people would feel the same kind of paralysis. Just a general feel of how applicable do you feel those lessons are to people in general that you've met? Or are there people who you think, well, okay, this person is completely differently and they obviously don't need those kind of constraints? Or do you, like most of the people you meet?
I would say, I mean, everybody works a different way, obviously, like, that's a given. But I find that we don't talk about the downsides of going indie and failure and feeling awful and everything, and so that's why I like to talk about it. And maybe not everybody has that same exact experience with like, oh, I felt awful because I couldn't do anything and I failed a few times and whatever, but everybody has this experience of having a rough patch, I think, when they first start out being an independent developer, or even like going on any sort of weird creative process, you know, whatever. You can apply this to a bazillion different industries. And so that's sort of why I like talking about it, and even if you have a completely different experience than me, I feel like I've talked to a lot of people who are just happy that they're not alone in feeling whatever they felt, which is why I like to talk about the emotional side of going indie as well. Oh, I had something really good to say, and then I forgot it. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So every week I started from scratch, and I would sort of make it a general rule to not touch the game again after I released it. But what I usually did was a lot of the feedback could be used in subsequent games. You know, like I made a game one week that had a leaderboard, and that leaderboard was immediately hacked by a friend of mine, you know, and showed all these insecurities in the way that I did my netcode. So I could take that, and then next time I made a leaderboard on something, I made it better, and he hacked that one too, and so then I made it better. You know, and so even though I wouldn't really fix things on the games, and every now and again there were just bugs that were applicable to only that game, which I sort of disregarded for the most part, and I would try and focus on the feedback that I could use like that, where I could take it week for week for week. Especially things like in terms of usability of, you know, I think that this is a really intuitive way to play a game, and then it turns out that nobody knew how to play that game. So, you know, I rethink my own ideas about how I interact with games and how I think other people interact with games. So I didn't, like I said, didn't touch the games after I released them, but I tried to take all the feedback to like the subsequent weeks. Anybody else? Oh.
Yes, I have a question. Have you used any of the games you produced, like ideas or concepts, in later, after you kind of finished your...
I haven't yet. There's a number of games that I really, really, really liked that I want to take further, and a few of them that I have like actual plans for and have like sort of started working on, but I haven't done anything yet. But there were a number of them, like, I would say out of the 46 games that I ended up actually creating, there's like 4 that I could actually see doing something, and like 1 that I have a real plan for, which I think is a pretty good, you know, ratio there. But I haven't yet, but you watch out. It'll be coming. Okay. Also, that's me on Twitter, you know, be my friend. There we go. That's all. And you can talk to me, and I'll talk to you about feelings and games. It'll be great. Okay, bye.